The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below.
Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss. In our last lecture on Debussy's La Mer, we just peeled back the very first few pages of the third movement. What we found there were very evocative, somewhat programmatic gestures that didn't necessarily add up to main themes or a strong thematic exposition. Now, as we go a little deeper into this movement, we're actually immediately confronted with possibly the strongest theme of the entire work. These quarter note triplets, ba-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-dum. Even though that theme seems very simple and is very directly orchestrated, it still has a sense of inevitability springing out of the sort of roiling waters of the introduction to this movement. We see certain elements of orchestration and of motive being developed in different ways. For instance, do you remember the opening ba-ba-dee-da-dum with the double basses? Here we're seeing a very similar gesture occur. So basically, that upward thrusting chromatic push that was in the double basses is now interpreted across all the lower strings, basses, cellos, and violas, at 3 octaves apart. And that just simply serves as this sort of pulsing accompaniment to the first statement of this melodic material. And really, other than that observation, that the lower strings basically just stay in parallel octaves, there really isn't much more to say until we get to the end here. So the question really becomes, how is this orchestrated in terms of the melody and in the harmony in winds and brass? Starting off, as you might notice in your own copy if you are following along, say with the Dover edition, which I believe is the same edition that is uploaded to IMSLP. Right here, the score does not actually tell you how many oboes are being used. However, I just dropped this in here, A2, so that you would know that this was doubling oboes. And you can actually hear that slightly rough quality, can't you, when you listen to the melody unfold. There's either a sense of somewhat hard playing, and by that I mean that there isn't this wonderful fluid quality to the oboe that we're used to hearing. The players will join up with this kind of perfection of tone, and in the joining, the timbre will become more trumpet-like. So that is the ideal condition of oboes A2. However, there is another kind of playing, which is that the players are just a little bit rough, and there's a sense of phasing quite similar to A2 clarinets. You know, that can also be a nice expressive idea, and that is sort of the approach that you're hearing from Kaleidoscope. The oboe players don't perfectly match their timbre together. It's a little looser, and that's okay too, just so long as it doesn't get too loose and you start to hear intonation problems. So that's not really the case with the recording that we're using. They do a fine job, but it isn't that sort of crystalline, very, very hard sound. Still, it's not perfect, right? And that's an actual choice that the players are making. It's not that they can't play perfectly together, it's just the way that they're playing in this particular interpretation. That sort of hard quality to the tone is strong enough to carry the top line all the way through this screen and the next one. So playing at an octave with that, we've got first bassoon, and on the second note of that bassoon, we have English horn coming in. This all may look confusing to you, but just remember that if we are up a sixth here from middle C, that is A, just like the oboe's A. And if we're down a fifth, transposing from the written E, that is also A, right? So pretty much everything is marked identically in these instruments in terms of the dynamics, the articulation, and so on. And right here, da-da-da, when we get to this held G sharp, that's when the first horn comes in and doubles it, and that tone quality that's added is just magical. Notice that it's just a touch. The first horn pulls out and then allows the double reeds to continue on with the melody, to complete the bar on their own. And it's a tricky little dance for the first horn player because they don't want to push into this crescendo too much. They really just want to just give a little bit of touch of that written E at the end and allow the double reeds to overtake them dynamically so that the end of their note basically just gets merged into the melodic motion. And that happens again right here. There really isn't any difference between these two bars here except for A natural to A sharp, right? So Debussy is sort of changing the harmonic context just a little bit. And it's a way of kind of amping up the expectation of the listeners each time so that he can land on this B and then climb down from it. And this continues on pretty much the same as before. Notice that the first bassoon takes over a harmonic role when it gets to this point, and the first horn player takes over on its voice, which you can see is unison with the English horn, right? Same exact written notes in treble clef, because they have the same transposition. The only difference here is that this B sharp is interpreted as C in the first horn. It's really not a big deal. I would actually keep this exactly the same in both parts, just in case an absent-minded conductor asks the player, oh, hey, about that B sharp that you got 6 bars after 46. They might say, B sharp, I've got a C. But anyway. Now here, the third horn player takes over that same position of being an octave lower and doubling the English horn. Notice how that third horn basically just plays this C, but the other players in that melody jump up a third and then start to go up chromatically so that they can reach A again on the next page, right? So that is how the melody is played. Now, let's take a look at the harmony, which is actually really simple right at the beginning. We've got these written E thirds, which, since that's an A clarinet, are actually written C sharp thirds, right? Which you can see in the bassoons. So, octaves apart, and stacking thirds. Remember how pungent those thirds were in the last lecture, when we had a stack of bassoons playing an E third, and then on top of that there were the clarinets, and on top of that the oboes, and then at the very top the flutes, and there was this almost whistling sound as the overtones kind of added up and kind of cascaded in the ear. So we have a little hint of that here, and as this G sharp kind of manifests itself as both a melodic and harmonic element, it will also add to that sense of cumulative overtones. Right in here, the second and third horn come in, and they basically take over what's going on in the bassoons, and that is why the bassoons come to an end right here. It's not because the bassoonist can't play further or that would ruin anything. That has nothing to do with it. It basically just gives the bassoons a break so they can have a little bit more of a breath, and allows the timbral quality of the horn to dovetail into and emerge from the bassoon sound, right? And then as we get this kind of echo, da-da-da, there's a nice big fat low C sharp on the contrabassoon. Of course, this is actually sounding at pitch, right? It's not the rock bottom C sharp of the bassoon that would be in the normal range. Because, just to remind everybody, once again, that our contrabassoon parts are scored at pitch rather than the standard octave transposition of double basses and contrabassoons that you would normally see. Now, right in here, the harmony is pretty much parallel. The clarinets right in here are basically being doubled an octave below by first bassoon and second bassoon on the second voice right in there. And then the third bassoon is providing yet another lower voice. And here things get a lot more complex, seemingly. I like how there's a little bit of rhythmic counterpoint with the melody in these quarter note triplets and the harmony having these dotted rhythms right in here. So they should not line up. This shouldn't be something that the player corrects, right? That they kind of move this a little forward so that it will fall right under the melody. It's better to go da-da-da-ba-da-da-da-ba-da. You know, it should have that kind of slightly skipping rhythm that you actually hear from the Moonlight Sonata. The little 16th note kind of scooting right in there between the last note of the triplet and the beginning of the next beat. Now notice how the horns are actually coming in with this harmonic duty above the melody in the third horn right in here. It's kind of wild to think about it, but they're doubling the clarinets right in here. And then here their parts diverge, more or less. We've got this middle voice right in here, which I think is so cool. And that eventually joins up in octaves with the first trumpet. I think that that is a really cool idea. Here you've got that second horn part eventually being joined and thickened by the bassoon. And then an octave higher, if we remember our comparative F transpositions, right? Up a fourth here, down a fifth there. An octave higher by first trumpet joining up with the first clarinet. And this is a little bit of a balancing act right in here. I would say that the brass really need to listen to the winds right in here and to merge with them. The last thing that is really worth noting here is how the bassoons eventually join their functions to the lower strings right in here, right? So hitting this C right in here is a little bit of an introduction to where the strings are going, ending up on the same C, and then the two parts join up, bassoons and lower strings, just doing this triplet down to the G natural, which we've got here, right? And that gives a beautiful solidity to the bottom end right in here. About the only other element that I haven't mentioned yet is this thump every 2 bars on the bass drum coming back over and over again. And when you think about it, this is beating in 2/2, right? So it really is every 4 beats, every 4 pulses. We're getting a punctuation from double bass, almost like 4/4 time. Except like when you get here and you add an extra bar, that idea unravels a little bit. Now on this next page, you'll see right away that these elements are basically just copy-pasted right onto this next screen. Well, actually, not literally copy-pasted. I actually used the next page in the actual score. So this is new information, at least in terms of engraving, if not in terms of actual music. And here, pretty much a similar approach is taken as was taken before, except that Debussy chooses to end this particular passage by making things less complex rather than more complex. And There's a sense of resolution, if you can call it that. It's not harmonic, but it's more emotional. We've got those same relationships going on here, oboes and English horn in octaves, with the first horn doubling the English horn, and the clarinets and bassoons basically providing parallel harmony. Very, very simple, just thirds, and it's really a simple harmonic picture. So let's listen to all of that, okay? There really isn't a whole lot to say in terms of comparing the two pages. Even though this second screen ends a little bit differently from the first one, it's really not significantly different to where you wouldn't understand what you're reading as you listen. So listen for all of those things that I talked about. The sort of freer A2 oboes right in there as played by Kaleidoscope. The wonderful way that English horn and first bassoon combine together and then have a little bit of their timbre co-opted by the first horn, which then releases and allows them to continue forward. I really love that. And then in here, how the first horn and then the third horn take over for the bassoon in that same role, doubling the English horn. That has a wonderful tone quality, by the way. Just really listen for that combination. If the players balance, it can sound, once again, very magical, rather than just the horn player dominating the English horn player. Listen for how those thirds stack up, sort of reminiscent of what we heard in the previous lecture, and how the horns take over for the bassoons and beautifully progress the timbre forwards, and these solid little C sharps in the contrabassoon. And then finally the way that the second bassoon and contra sort of pull everything down along with the lower strings. So effective. And then that inner voice right in here of second horn and first trumpet doubled by clarinet and first bassoon. Listen for all of those things, and I will see you on the third screen of this lecture. On this next page, we see a sort of a relaxing of the intensity of the orchestration and also a literal relaxing or downward motion of this inversion of one of the themes we saw before. Do you recall that little motive that we heard in the introduction section in this movement, and also taken from the first movement of La Mer, that goes da-dum? Now here we have a reversal, da-dum, right? It is the same exact thing, the same rhythmic value, and the same sense of singled out gestures, except it's just reversed. And it functions really beautifully as a bit of a release compared to the material that we just heard. So da-da-dun-da-dum. And notice the dynamics work beautifully in here. Da-da-dun-da-dum. What's really beautiful about this, A2 flutes, I added this A2, once again it's missing from the score itself. What's beautiful about this is that before we had basically double reed octaves, and here we've got A2 flutes in octaves with beautifully chesty tenor register Debussy cellos. And the smaller amount of cellos plus adding that to the flutes has both a wonderful timbral color and also a really great contrast from the previous material. That continues for this entire screen, but we do have a few elements carrying over, somewhat developed, in this screen. One is the sense of the bass drum punctuating, but here it's actually just responding. So there's pluck, boom, pluck, boom, pluck, boom, pluck, boom. Now what does that remind you of? It's the same kind of accompaniment that we hear in the Rite of Spring, which would be composed a few years later. You know, pluck, boom, bum, 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 bum. Right? So I would think of this as being an idea that may have influenced Stravinsky rather than necessarily being something that he stole. Do you know what I mean? Or something that he appropriated. Very simple ideas, really. It's all easily manageable without having to play Debussy here. These fifths on cellos, and then right here, this D natural right here is actually an open string. So all the violist needs to do is just finger this fourth right here below, and then they can pluck the entire thing, and then just adjust a little bit for this sharp note right in here. Then a simple B right in here with the seconds. Here we've got da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da, carrying over from what was in the lower strings. That same sense of energy and the lift and everything else that was introduced at the beginning of the movement. So that's the strings. Now, what's going on in terms of the winds? Well, we already saw the melodic gesture being taken over by the flutes. What's very cool here is that the English horn just doubles the cellos at the octave from the flutes every other bar. And that is a nice firming up of that timbre, right? But leaving it out in the first and third and fifth bar and so on, so that the melodic statement, what really gets your attention, da-dum, can just be cellos and flutes. Then oboes in harmony with horns, that's all pretty standard. And here we can see that this is doubling at an octave below. This A is actually sounding D, which is an octave with the first oboe. This F sharp sounding down a fifth at an octave from the B, and so on. And then little elements get added by the lower horns. I love that. It just thickens up the texture. The coolest part right in here for me is this wrong sounding C natural right here, actually sounding F. And you can see that played in some of the other parts here, like this F right in here, and then of course F natural in the third bassoon. But there's that wonderful sense of brashness right at the end of the crescendo, where you can really hear that fourth horn standing out. And even if they do have their intonation pretty good, or perfect, the way that the Kaleidoscope fourth hornist does, it'll still feel weird, that concert F just pushing out underneath everything else that's going on. The melody rises a little bit, and everything is swept along here by these firsts leaping up. And that is just the setup to this lovely part right in here. Let's look over the overall functions without getting too deep into the harmony and so on. I would say that the harmony here is definitely worth taking apart on your own. There is, I think, a 2-piano score on IMSLP where you can look over the different changes right in here, and they're really beautiful. But I really want to focus on the scoring. So let's do that by basically just looking at the functions right in here. It seems to me that a lot of what's going on here in these strings, these octaves in the first and seconds, is really kind of like icing on the cake. And even right in here, where the violas leap up and then the seconds leap up with them at the octave, it just really feels like it is kind of flurrying around the harmonic motion from horns and winds. And that's all good. It's not to diminish its role, but it's just kind of funny that you will really be listening to this wonderful, spiky, swooping string playing, probably catching your ear the most, just because it's the most in front and the most active. But I feel that really what's going on here is what you're hearing kind of at the crest of the wave in terms of the harmony. It's really great the way this is scored. tenuto, right? So big blocky notes, and then staccato, marcato. Well, marcato is already kind of a bit staccato in inference, right? It has the sense of being a short note just because the note is such a powerful punch, right? So you would assume that a punch wouldn't be something that would last for an enormous long time. It's not like somebody is going to put their fist in your face and then just leave it there, right? They're going to pull their arm back. So there will already be the sense of shortness a little bit in the marcato accent. But sometimes, as we saw in previous scoring for this movement, marcato will be joined with a tenuto mark, right? So that means a very fast, punchy accent at the beginning of a note and then hanging on to it with a very, very blocky style. So it's a bit of an overemphasis to mark the staccato, but it just makes it even shorter, in my view, right? It's not all that necessary. I would say don't go crazy on marcato staccato. Just maybe save it for a moment like this. The scoring in the winds and the brass balance really beautifully. This is a case where the horns are not stepping on the toes of any of the wind parts except for some doubling in the English horn and some enclosures in the bassoons. So the harmonic rolls are spread out enough to where you don't have to worry about marking down the horns to prevent them from overbalancing certain wind voices. Really nicely done right in here. And that's also joined by the lower strings right in there. So it's really great pushing music, you know, ba-da, ba-da, right in here. And then some of that continues on as the strings leap upwards right here. And you've got this lovely triplet right in here that's just so easy to not catch by the ear. That is eventually joined up on the same pitches by pizzicato, punctuating the beginning of every quarter value. Really where your ear is going to be directed, though, aside from all of these flurries, are these A2 clarinets. And their wonderful bright color, I think, really pulls at the ear right in here. Really great scoring. And then here we've got this really great symphonic moment. Once again, if we're thinking of symphonic scoring as being voices that work together to progress a certain musical idea, something that we're going to get into very, very much more over the next few lectures. Flutes and oboes doubling right here, all the way through to the end of the page, and English horn playing in harmony right underneath, sort of forming the third voice underneath in three-part harmony. Then we have the clarinets coming in below that, basically doubling the octave with the flutes and oboes, and bassoons right in here, basically doubling what's going on with the English horn at the octave. And then here things get reedier as they get lower, don't they? Right towards the end, you really hear that wonderfully resonant quality coming to the fore. Not even just the reeds as a category, but the reeds as an actual quality of tone production. Getting very, very pungent right in here. The flutes are pretty much going to disappear from the sound picture. They're going to end up coloring the oboes just a little bit. So, you know, might as well leave them in if the diminuendo is drastic enough. But otherwise, I would say the flutes are kind of not really needed. This is the kind of scoring where you'll see something like this in a masterpiece like this and think, well, why can't I just do this all the time? I'll just score the flutes doubling the oboes right in here and that'll be great. And if that ends up in an orchestration challenge entry, then I end up calling the orchestrator on it and saying, listen, the flutes are really not going to contribute that much, if anything. If this is going to go forte crescendo to, say, fortissimo and then diminuendo back to forte, then the flutes are pretty much absent from the tone picture. However, I'm not going to subtract the notion that wind players listen to each other and make certain adjustments, but this is just so resonant and so full that even these soft elements in here, this horn right in here, piano, going to that same sounding G, will pretty much obliterate what's going on in the flute. Sorry to say it. I think it works with a chamber orchestra like Kaleidoscope, where the winds are unusually keen in listening to each other, but I think in big symphonic interpretations of this, you pretty much won't hear the flutes. But speaking of symphonic scoring, we've got this big expression right in here, and we have these other elements all working together, but having their separate sort of zones of influence. This da-da-da-da-da-da. Interesting how you see a staccato at the beginning of a tie, right? So it's a bit of a compromise between the two elements. I would say probably better to leave the tie out and even the note out, because you'll get the same effect as this kind of scoring. We can see the horns starting up this rhythm that is repeated much, much higher by the violins, but right in here really becoming part of the wind texture. That repeats again, and then actually the strings continue on. I love this thump right in here. I love this splash right in here of the cymbal. That really provides perfect pacing of this bar, doesn't it? So this kind of grunt here on third bassoon and lower strings, kicking off the horns, starting their rhythm, which kind of counterpoints with this chorale in the winds. And then continuing on, you'll actually hear the horns very, very clearly throughout all of this. Continuing on together, strings, and then splash on the fourth beat. And then a higher pizzicato here from the middle strings. And then everything just kind of settling down towards the end here. Forte, mezzo piano. So I would say, in regard to this, seeing how the strings get softer and softer as a conductor, and also noticing how third bassoon, contrabassoon, and first horn are instructed to come in here soft, I would actually be trying to control this hairpin right in here, so pretty much we would all end up right around mezzo piano by the middle of this bar. So that is enough to think about for this lecture. Listen for that beautiful symphonic moment right in here that I just described. Listen for the way the horns and the winds work together right in here, and that lovely fat A2 melody right in here in the clarinets. The way the strings dance around all that harmonic information. And then the contrast of melodic timbre that this provides with the previous screen that we studied at the beginning of the lecture. And the reversal of that little motive. Da-da to da-dum dum. The way that the English horn comes in and thickens the cello line right in here. That kind of pre-Stravinsky pluck thump, pluck thump, pluck thump. And the wonderful roll in here of pianissimo horns eventually emerging outwards and pushing towards the next screen. So listen for all of those cool things, and I will see you again pretty quickly for the next lecture in this series, and then we'll have a break of about 6 weeks. So I'll come in again at the end of October with the remaining lectures for this entire series of lectures on La Mer. It's really been wonderful. I've enjoyed this so much, and I can't wait to start the next lecture series, for which I've completed all of the screens for us to look at, and that is going to be a huge leap into an incredibly formative period for our entire conception of what orchestration really is.